Welcome to the FinWise Ion podcast series, where we bring you the latest insights across the fintech banking, card, payments, and lending industries. In each episode, we sit down with industry insiders and experts and dive into the hottest topics and trends that you need to keep an eye on. Time to take off for another episode of the Ion podcast.
I'm Sarah Grutta, Deputy Chief FinTech Officer here at FinWise Bank. Welcome and thank you for joining us for another in our series of FinWise Ion podcast. In this edition, we're keeping an eye on the all-important FinTech and bank partnership relationships. And within that topic, I really want to dig into a relatively new concept that we're starting to see get some attention in our marketplace, and that's the idea of a backup bank. So really looking forward to today's conversation. And to provide some insights on these topics, today's special guest, Christian Gennaro, who manages bank partnerships at Galileo, is here with us today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yep, happy to be here. And because we've chatted a little bit before, I know we both bring a lot of passion to the topic. So I'm excited to discuss it with you.
Yeah, so let's just go ahead and kick this off and, tell us what you do in your role at Galileo.
Sure. So I am responsible for our strategic bank partnerships. And that means I look kind of both out into the marketplace, figure out which banks we should be partnering with on behalf of our clients. And then internally, Galileo, I think, saw the opportunity while we have a lot of folks who interact with our sponsor banks in business development, implementation, and then ongoing operations. There wasn't somebody kind of taking the holistic horizontal view at Galileo to really make sure everything came together. So I joined actually about 2.5 years ago, and that's been my role, and I've had a great time there. And like I said, it's not new that we interact with partner banks. That's always been the case. But now we're really trying to take a more strategic, holistic view into how we do that.
That's incredible. And I when I think about your role there, I have to imagine that you have really that bird's eye view of what's going on in the fintech marketplace these days, particularly when it comes to, how they're interacting with processors and with their banks. So give us a little feeling for what is it that you're seeing these days?
Yeah, and I have to say it really actually started right when I got to Galileo. So, it's not like all of a sudden, with SVB,
Right.
Everything did change with SVB. But even when I joined Galileo, first we were hearing more from the bank partners, right? About things that they were focused on, reconciliation, compliance, et cetera. So starting to get a little bit of a feel for where the direction was going. And then clearly, since SVB and all of the regulatory announcements, et cetera, I think on two sides. From the banks, like we're really hearing, seeing them and hearing the need for them to make sure that from a compliance perspective, they're doing everything that they need to do. And since we play a critical role on behalf of our clients at Galileo in providing reporting to banks, right, both financial and if they're using some of our services, compliance reporting, we play a critical role on behalf of our clients to get that to their sponsor bank. And then what I'm hearing from prospects and clients through both directly from them and then through our BD folks and our account managers is, I think what brought this topic up, is the need for, I'll say in general, a new sponsor bank. And that there's a couple of things driving that, right? There's, just an understanding that maybe they need to diversify a little bit, and that gets into the backup concept. There's a lot of movement right now. And so, between banks, some banks deciding that it's not for them to stay in the industry and programs need to move. And then there's just basically growth, right? Programs want to grow, and maybe their current sponsor doesn't necessarily support a new product that they want to move into. So I will say, I get on a weekly basis, I get multiple pings on behalf of clients and prospects asking, what should I do in terms of a new sponsor bank? And those are all the different scenarios. So.
Yeah, I want to dig into that just a little bit more, first on, the change that you began to see when you first joined Galileo, maybe a couple years ago. And, I had sort of gotten out of the fintech space for a little while. I came back in and I was really shocked at how much the fintechs were driving the deals, and they were driving the banks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the fintechs were saying, okay, bank, here's how much I'm willing to pay you for your services. And I was like, wait a minute, did I just fall down some rabbit hole or something? What happened? And it was
Yep.
amazing that occurred, but now it's like done this 180, I think.
Yes. And I think and I spend a lot of time trying to be, the voice of my stakeholder, which are the sponsor bank partners. I spend a lot of time, one of my roles is to really try to make both sides understand each other. And I spend
Yeah.
a lot of my time trying to explain what I see as the bank's perspective.
Yeah.
And I think, what has shifted in the past 2 years is really, I'm going to say, the recognition, because it's always been there, right? But the recognition of the role of the bank. And I do say, one of the things, you're going to love this, is, someone's like, I want a bank that's more flexible in compliance. And I'm like, okay. Let's take a moment, bank. Like, in my personal opinion, you don't want a bank that's flexible in compliance. You want a bank that's reg savvy, right? They understand the regulations, they know how to et cetera. Because ultimately, the regulators view the customer, right? And the fintech, from a business perspective, it's their customer, but the regulators view that as the bank's customer. And I try to explain that, that all well and good from a business model perspective, right? What you want to do, but you need to understand that this is a heavily regulated space. And actually, you want your sponsor bank to be reg savvy. And by reg savvy, I mean that, they understand the regulations, they have a very good relationship with their regulator, and anyone who's kind of taken a look into this space knows that, like, a bank could have multiple regulators, more or less coordinated depending. And you want to make sure that they know how to deal with that scenario. So I do spend a lot of time, on behalf of my sponsor bank partners,
Mm-hmm.
really trying to make sure that both internal stakeholders and external, clients and prospects understand that.
Yeah, well, thank you for that role that you play,
I'm
because I
trying.
think I certainly see it in the fintechs that we get to talk to here at FinWise, that the message is getting through. And what I've even started to see in a couple of instances is where the fintech will come to us and say, prove to us, bank, that you understand regulation. And I
Right.
think that's
Right.
great.
Yes. Yep, totally. And I think our, across Galileo, I think everybody who interacts with our clients, again, I'm out there beating the drum, is trying to explain it from the bank's perspective. And I can say, from BD through our implementation team, et cetera, those folks are saying, if you're looking for a sponsor bank, you're going to want to have your ducks in a row, right? You're going to want to understand, what the bank is going to expect from you. From a compliance perspective, if you're your own program manager, you're going to need to have compliance personnel that understand it. And I do think, one of the things that I have, we'll get into it, but I have my little list of the things that I would ask about would be, to your point, how do you deal with compliance? What's your relationship with your regulator? How do you interact with them? How are you staffed? Are you using any automation? And, what can I expect? So I do try to do my bit and coach, our mutual clients,
Mm-hmm.
into thinking from that perspective, because it's really an advantage, right? If you have a bank that's really good at compliance, right? Not flexible, very good at
Right.
compliance,
Yeah.
and find solutions, right? Understanding what you want to do. Flexible always makes me think, cutting corners and bending the rules, and you don't want to do that. But I think I'm glad to hear that you're hearing, folks asking about that, because I think they should be.
Yeah. Yeah. So in addition to, educating fintechs and program managers, I kind of see your role also as matchmaker, right? You've got to
Yep.
get the right bank connected with the right fintechs. So, when you find program managers that are considering a bank, whether it's a new bank, whether they're adding a bank, or they need to switch banks, which is happening with greater frequency, unfortunately,
Yep.
recently, how is it that you try and make that match? How do you make sure that philosophically the fintech and the bank are aligned?
Right. And, this is a delicate place because, sponsor banks work with multiple processors work with multiple banks. But what we try to do across Galileo, so both my BD counterparts and myself, what we try to do is for each of our strategic bank partners is to really understand where is that bank focused, right? So not only, what kind of bins do they support, consumer, commercial, et cetera, but really understand where they are focused, what lines of business they want to engage in, what their criteria are in terms of experience and size, and really try to understand that across each sponsor bank. And then if a prospect or an existing client says, can you give me some banks to reach out to? What we try to do is say, okay, these are banks who can support your use case. That's very important because not every bank will support every use case. This is what we know about them. These are some of the things that they'll be looking for. And then what we really try to do, and I think this is a theme across, we try to take, I'm going to say the friction out of the process as much as possible, right? By, we'll make an introduction. We'll speak with our sponsor bank counterparts. If there's a fintech who's talking to both of us, what concerns do they have? How can we address them? And I think that's really at Galileo kind of the secret sauce, which is that partnership perspective, across the board. But usually we try to make sure that, first of all, the use case is supported, that the program really kind of meets, I'm going to say, the financial and size criteria of the bank. And then just what we know about the bank from the different, I'll say, kind of solutions and different services that they'll support. So that's how we think about it, those three ways.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's helpful. And I think, one of the things that we do from the bank perspective, I mean, we love to get some of the fintechs that have been, sort of pre-vetted by,
Yep.
the issuer processors. A lot of times that's always very, very helpful. And then one of the things that we do after we have some conversations, one of the really early conversations we have with fintechs is to talk through two topics. And this is BSA and reporting. And to me,
Yep.
those are so key. And if we can get alignment on those topics, again, from the bank perspective, then I think just about everything else that comes up that you find out in the deep discovery process through onboarding is probably something that can be resolved. But those
Right.
are two things I think are just so key from a philosophical standpoint
Yep.
that there needs to be alignment on.
Right. And I do think, we joke about kind of the matchmaking and the partnership, but from the fintech's perspective, right, their sponsor bank and their processor, I think, are really two of the key relationships, right, the underpinning that lets them function in the financial services realm. And, really finding that match, right, making sure that there's clarity in terms of obligations, right, that they understand what their obligations are going to be, they know what they're going to have to share, and getting that out, I think up front and having that discussion. I am privy to a lot of discussions. One of the other ways that we at Galileo try to align and remove as much friction out of the process is we've introduced something we call implementation alignment, which is where we have a number of programs going on. We'll get together at a management level with our counterparts at the sponsor bank and just make sure we're aligned. What are we hearing, et cetera. And countless times in those discussions, I've heard about, fintechs bringing up something new, kind of to your point, that they want to do that hasn't been part of the discussions before. And usually it touches an area of, compliance, not only BSA, could be other things. And I think what you're saying is so important, that you really want to have those, I'm going to call them those use case discussions, right, up front, and be as transparent as possible, because if you don't settle them up front, they will come up down the line. And then, your implementation may be stalled because that has to be worked out. So I think your approach of really trying to align in those two areas right up front is a really good one.
Yeah. And of course, use cases, and let me dig into that a little bit too, again, because I'm just so excited to talk to you, because you've got that great marketplace viewpoint. Are you seeing any interesting shifts in the use cases? Go back again, 2 to 3 years ago, and it was like everybody was starting a neobank, and everybody's gonna provide banking services to the underbanked and unbanked and things like that, and that got to be a little bit of a commodity. So what's the latest trend around use cases? Are you seeing a bunch of stuff like cross border? Are you seeing it? Is that a lot of it?
And I think, yes. And I think, cross border, kind of what's new and not what's untried. So, cross border. And that can, there's still remittance solutions, maybe more upmarket. I think we've talked about use cases where, there are the card holder is not necessarily based in the U.S. or a
Mm-hmm.
company wants to give subsidiaries cards. And those are what I try to tell my constituents and stakeholders. Those are more complicated,
Yeah.
and they should expect that it's going to take longer to get through that. We see a lot of demand for that. The other thing that I see a lot of demand for is, I guess what we would call embedded finance, where, and this I think from a bank and processor's perspective, we like this, right? It's a company that offers other service products and they want to, add payments as part of it. And I would say that's usually a more straightforward use case, but the client or prospect isn't necessarily coming in with an understanding of all the obligations they might take on because it's not their core business. Someone who payments is going to be their focus might have done a little, whatever, maybe more familiar with it. And then the last thing that we see is a lot of clients and prospects wanting to add on. So, if they maybe they want to go more upmarket, maybe they want to add, if they've got debit products, they want to add credit products. Maybe if they have credit products, they want to, add other features, BNPL, installment, et cetera. So we really are, and I think this speaks to kind of the maturity or the maturation process that the market is going into, right? You can't really be a one-trick pony.
Mm-hmm.
And so we see that kind of expansion, both, if you are already focused on offering, financial products, you want to offer more of them. And if you have a product where there's a good synergy, then you want to, add. So I think, there's some more complex, but I see also a lot of, I think the cross-border one is the I'm going to say kind of net new, but I think what we're seeing is kind of what I'm seeing is really that expansion of wanting to offer more products. And that could, you could do that with your existing sponsor bank. You might need a new sponsor bank to do that. All of those things might come up.
Yeah. So that to me, I think is indicative of the marketplace in part shifting away from the old interchange model. Like you and I
Yes.
remember back in the day when it was
Yep.
prepaid and it
Yep.
was all interchange. That was the name of the
Yep.
game,
Right.
and the card and all the services associated with it were free to the end user. But I
Right.
think the market, and we've been saying this for years, we got to get away from the interchange
Right. Right.
business model, right? And I think that's
Right.
finally breaking through, right? Because to your point, now people are talking about, I'm not going to just offer this one-off product. I'm offering a suite of products. That suite of product might be embedded within a group of other services. And oh, by the way, I can charge a fee for those things.
Right. Right. And I think, to your point, the day of a prospect being exciting, when they only have one source of revenue to drive their business model, and that is interchange. We all know that's not a good place to go. But I think also it is, this is always, I think, the challenge with, free and cheaper and everything, which is it's really not free to provide any service.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think, um, trying to make your business model work with no fees at all, and just living off of interchange income, right? That's not a sustainable business model. And I've worked in financial services basically my whole career, and I really do think very valuable products. I always joke everyone pays.
Yeah.
Not everyone necessarily takes a loan, but everybody pays. So it's a universal product, and but it's a valuable product both for companies and for businesses, and I think it should be, the value should be priced accordingly. But I think we are finally getting away from that. I know from our perspective, we want potential clients who have, ideally they would have an existing customer base. I think again, as we said, all the things that the bank would be interested in as well, and that their business model is not solely reliant on interchange.
Yeah. Yeah. So how does a fintech go about looking for a new sponsor bank? I mean, do they just go down the list and start dialing, or do you find that
Right.
really processors like yourself are kind of in the middle, and they're kind of the go-to source
Right. I
for
think
finding the right match?
Yeah, I think, and like you, I've kind of been in and out of different parts of the industry. So I think when I joined Galileo, we were already seeing that shift. I think probably earlier, prospects would go to the bank first. I think now, and maybe because it's really they need to understand on both sides, they need to understand the capability. But I think the market has shifted. I think they are often coming to the processor first, and typically, if they've come and they've already talked with different sponsor banks, we will tell them which ones we're already integrated with because clearly, that's an advantage right there. And like everyone else, you have to consider the number of partners you integrate with, and so that's not limitless, right? um, but if they really would like our guidance in terms of which banks to talk with, we will, as I said, we'll kind of give them a curated list, I like to say, with kind of what we think about. Always offer to make warm introductions. Sometimes people want that, sometimes they don't, up to them. And then what we try to do is both, just have those three-way conversations, if sometimes it's together or separately, really just to keep, each other up to date on what's going on, and then just really trying to help our, client or prospect understand kind of the culture of the bank. And I was talking with our producer earlier before we started the podcast that I really love to travel, and I've lived in and traveled in and worked in a lot of different countries. But what I think I love and what is common about business and the type of roles I'm drawn to is, translation, please. Like, how can I help you understand the culture and what they're going to be looking at? And so I think it comes down to understanding, the client's use case or prospective client's use case, what they have to offer, understanding what the bank is going to like, and then or react to, and then giving them a curated list. I mean, we had someone recently who was insisting upon an introduction to two different banks for their use case. Like, well, we can introduce you, but we know they're not going to support your use case. But please, happy to introduce you. Don't want to stand in front of that. So I think that's really the process that we go through.
And I have to imagine that you're seeing a lot more of those types of requests. Please introduce us to additional banks. There's been a tremendous amount of churn in the marketplace. And do you have some thoughts on what the reasons for that might be? I mean, other than the obvious ones where it's like, oh my goodness, my bank just got a consent order, they're getting out of the business, help me. But are there some other reasons why fintechs and program managers are looking for banks?
Right. Well, I will say that's a big one. Yeah. That is a big one, and there's time pressure there, right? Sure. So that is a big one. I think, kind of to how you opened up, there's this topic of I don't want to leave my current sponsor bank, but I want a backup bank. And I think, backup bank is a nice pithy phrase, right? But I try to unpack that, if I'm talking with a client or prospect about what does that actually mean and what they have to think about. And mostly what I try to say is that both from a relationship perspective, right? Your bank doesn't necessarily, they don't want to be your backup prom date, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So they don't want to be your backup date. But also, if you think about what goes on, like having a second bank partner kind of waiting in the wings. It's not like, I use the analogy, it's not like a generator that you're going to turn it on and off when the electricity goes out, right? There's a lot of work that goes into preparation. Even if you have the same features and functionalities on the front end, there might be differences on the back end. I mean, probably you're going to try to work out from a compliance perspective, but it's something where, it is a relationship and it requires, all the parts to be in working order, and you can't just flip that relationship on and off. So what I try to tell clients who ask for Galileo's advice in this regard is I try to tell them to really think about, when you're looking for a second bank for your portfolio, you really need to think about that. I mean, it's a business proposition for all the parties involved. Is there a part of your business that you would commit? Because again, both conceptually and from kind of a revenue perspective, being a backup bank isn't really attractive. But I think, equally so, it's just not automatic to switch back and forth, right? You really need to think about, everything that's going into managing that second partner bank.
Yeah, those are great points. And I've actually been asked by some fintechs, hey, could you just sort of take us through your due diligence and just kind of sit there in the background, and if something ever happens with my existing bank, I'm just going to call on you and we'll start issuing. And it's like, it doesn't work
Right.
that way. It really doesn't.
Right.
You have to be in production. You have to
Right.
have, live business flowing through the system in order for, that partnership to actually work when it's really needed. And I won't call it a crisis, but when it's
Yeah.
needed,
Right.
for purposes where quick action is needed. And yeah, as I'm not going to be, to your point, the second string for a
Right.
program.
Exactly.
That's not a role I want to play.
Right.
So I think there's different strategies for approaching it. It's, perhaps, to your point, we see fintechs that are expanding their suite of products. So maybe you establish your second product or additional product with a new financial institution so you can develop that relationship. Because, yeah, the economics absolutely positively have to work, or, we're not going to be, we as a bank are not going to be interested in that at
Right.
all. And I think what might be interesting, and we'll have to see if this plays out in the marketplace too, if we start to see banks beginning to partner, to say bank A and bank B are forming this sort of backup bank
Right.
coalition.
Right.
So if you're a customer on bank A, you
Right.
might want to look over at this bank B as that quote unquote backup bank solution, because we know already that they're kind of aligned, at least from a use case perspective, their approach to compliance and those topics. So I'm wondering if we won't see that starting to emerge.
Yeah, and that's actually, I think, a really good uh, what a really good business idea, because I think by definition, right, if I have to find two banks, and there are large programs in market that have multiple banks for basically, the same type of product.
Sure.
Basically by definition, I'm going to try to find two partners to align. Otherwise, it's
Yeah.
not going to be the same. It's going to be more difficult. And so if you can kind of prepackage that, it actually makes me think, when I originally came into payments, I was real focused on the credit side, and you did have banks that would partner for the downsell, right? You would, because whichever co-brand partner, right? A lot of analogies here, would want to be able to offer credit products to all of their customers, but not every bank would underwrite every segment, right? And so you had established relationships. The client could go and find two banks, but there were also established relationships, right, for that quote unquote downsell from a credit perspective, thinking about the riskier markets. And I think it absolutely makes sense for those kind of partnerships to emerge. Something else you said also kind of tagged it. I think the one of the things I think in helping clients understand that the business model needs to work. Even if they were to pay minimums and do nothing, right? It's something that you talked about in terms of already being in production. And when as Representative Galileo, I'm trying to give I'm trying to provide a what sort of realistic view of the challenges. And one of the things that I say is that sponsor banks, the cutoffs may be a little bit different, but in general, your sponsor bank is doing your implementation, negotiating the contract, and completing due diligence, right, as you're getting to market. So if you just have a term sheet and an MSA, right, and let's say you don't actually, let's say you find a bank that's willing to just sit there and wait, when it comes time to actually switch to that bank, not only don't you have kind of the mechanisms in place, but most likely, based upon the time that's elapsed, you're going to have to redo due diligence, right? And so it just doesn't make sense. The other thing to think about a backup bank is, if I don't already have that in play, well, what am I actually going to do for my existing clients? It might be one thing to acquire new clients, but am I going to have my card holders, set up on both systems? That's not going to work. How am I going to get their balances to go from one to the other? Like, there are a lot of operational considerations in kind of, turning on, your second bank, which just it's not a flip of a switch kind of thing. And so I try to use, I don't want to scare people off by talking too much about the complexity, but I also just try to say, think about what's involved in doing this so that you don't get, we don't have prospects, approaching our bank partners about something that's not feasible. But I do love that idea of, are there kind of pairs of banks that we know will work in tandem, and will accept that? Because I do think, we're kind of coming from a point where I think, efficiency has been king. I want to, do everything with one bank. It's less work. I'll get volume pricing, et cetera, to realizing that, well, there's value in diversification, right? I need to diversify for a number of reasons, but I still want to do it as efficiently as possible. So I think that alignment idea is a great one.
Yeah. So this is probably a little bit of an unfair question, but just your thoughts on, is there a moment in a fintech's maturity when it's kind of the moment when they need to start to look for a second financial institution?
Right. And I do think it's kind of, it's that scenario planning aspect that every company should be doing. I think that it's going to be different for each entity to decide when that is, right? When does kind of the efficiency versus diversification equation shift? But I think a couple of things. I think the more, first of all, clearly the larger you are, right? But the more central your product is to the functioning of your end user, right? The more essential it is to their functioning, right? I think, the sooner you're going to want to do that. On the other hand, right, as an individual, I was trying to think about that. If I'm here by myself, I don't necessarily have, two cars and alternate, driving them, every day and keep two in the driveway, because I know I'm going to have to go somewhere, right? There's a point at which maybe I would do that if I were on the road, or I always felt there's a creakiness. So I think, each bank has to decide that, each fintech has to decide that on their own. I think there's some good arguments for doing it earlier in the process. I think then, as a fintech, you would be really learning from having two partners, right? That's an advantage in diversification. But I think you also do have to take kind of the resources and the cost. If you're splitting at the beginning, if you're splitting volume between two banks, right, clearly that's going to be more expensive. So I think each business really has to think about that for themselves, but I think it has to be part of their roadmap. They have to understand, like, what is going to have to be true for me to start my discussions with a second bank.
And it might even be a third, right? I mean, it could be something where you figure out, because I'm not sure that there's necessarily a bright line to say this is the exact number of financial institutions you need to support your business, right? That's
right. And no, and it may also be like, maybe I have two for this product, maybe then for a different product. But I also think, kind of taking a step back, also, I think we're in a phase where, as an industry, we're going through a lot of, I'm going to say, maturation pains, not growing pains, right? And I do think, right, there is so much information, and both from what the regulators are looking at to what the banks who are making it through this are doing. Like, what I don't want to happen is that our industry comes to something, well, it's so unstable, right, that I have to have multiple banks. Like, yes, we're going through a time of change, and I'm going to say kind of instability right now. Players are coming in and players are coming out, but like, that's not our end goal as an industry, right? Yeah. We want to make sure that, as providers, we understand what's going on in the market. We incorporate that in how we do business, and we come out steadier and stronger. So I also don't want to paint the picture that, like, I should be, constantly worried about this, because I really want, us as an industry to say, okay, this is what we need to be doing in terms of compliance. This is what we need to be doing in terms of regulation. This is, as a processor, what I need to demonstrate. As a sponsor bank, this is what we need to demonstrate. And then, put this behind us and move on. So I also don't want to create this idea that we're going to be living, in a kind of this period of churn and instability forever, right? We're going to learn from what's happening, and all of the providers are going to come out, I think, stronger for it. So
yeah,
I think
I
it's a little
certainly
bit of a
agree with,
balance.
yeah, I certainly agree with you on that point. I do think it'll be interesting though, as things, I think once things start to subside and we kind of have that opportunity to do the look back and figure out what it is that we can do to make sure issues that we're currently facing don't happen again. I think that's also going to be when we start to see the regulators come in with their ideas. And
Yep.
I think the concept of backup bank might be one of those ideas that comes into play from regulators. And I wonder if for certain programs, perhaps those that are consumer based,
Yep.
and maybe those that reach a certain size, where the backup bank concept might be a requirement.
Yeah. But I think, I'm going to say what would cause me, besides wanting diversification, right? What would cause me to like think that I would always need a backup bank? I'm going to take the contrarian view here
Awesome.
for a moment,
Awesome.
right? What would cause me going forward? What has caused me now to want a backup bank, and is that going to be true in the future? Well, what's causing people to want to have a backup bank, right, is um, clearly there was, the run on SVB that brought everyone's attention. So there's kind of like, the financial liquidity and the speed at which deposits can move, et cetera. That's one concern, right? The other concern right now comes back to compliance, right? And that's why, as you said, you're starting to get the question, well, prove to me that you do compliance well, right? And that first one, like, that's going to be, I think, that is going to be, I don't want to say a moment in time, but it's going to be a moment in time, and we're going to learn from that. And then the regulators, I think it's actually good. I think it's fairly unprecedented to have, the three major federal regulatory agencies issuing joint guidance,
Yeah.
joint RFI, et cetera. So I think like there's going to be like new kind of parameters put in place and requirements, and this is going to be put behind us. And so we shouldn't have banks that are unable to continue their business because of a compliance perspective or lack of clarity, right? If there's an issue, then they knew it, et cetera. So I think then the other thing comes down to, and this is not an area that I'm an expert in, but I know this is going on, the question of broker deposits, et cetera. Then I think assuming my bank knows how to do their business, right, which is why I'm hiring them. Then comes the question of, in this new area of, I think they call hot money, right? Not hot like illegal, but just like money can move very quickly, right? Are there the right parameters in place so that you don't have, on the basis, I'm going to say, of speculation and rumors, you don't have everybody withdrawing their banks and causing a bank failure. And that's different, right? And again, I'm not an expert in this area, so I will not opine further. But I think in that first reason for looking for a quote backup bank, like we as an industry, like we have the opportunity, and I think we will kind of address it. New standards will in place, and we'll move on. So I don't think that would be a reason to have a backup bank going further, right? I think it's liquidity, and then frankly, diversification is good. You get new ideas from diversification.
Yeah. I think what it is, at least in my mind, is, what are you, and by you, I mean, the fintech, the program manager, the processor, and the financial institution, the collective you. What are you doing to protect the end user?
Yep.
And that could mean a myriad of different things. A backup bank might be one of those things, right? That
Yeah.
that is kind of that alternative. It's a means of supporting a program when you need to move accounts for whatever reason. But I hope that as an industry we don't get too prescriptive,
Yeah.
meaning that you've got to have this amount in reserves, you've got to have this many backup banks, you've got to, because that I think would just really spoil everything going on that we know and love about fintech, which is
Right.
the ingenuity, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, and if it's too prescriptive, then you don't have ingenuity, and people go and use their brilliant minds in another industry. So we don't want that to happen. I
Yeah.
would agree with you there.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Got it. So one last question while I've got you is how do you really view that issuer processor bank relationship, that trika, and how do you set those relationships up for success?
yeah. So, and this again, I think at Galileo, this is our it's kind of in the DNA. I really like the culture when I arrived, which is really trying to partner with our clients to solve problems. And I think now with my role in place, we're kind of putting that with our sponsor banks as well. And again, not that we didn't do it everybody in their individual role, but doing it in a more, I'm going to say, programmatic fashion. At the same time, every partnership is different, right? That's why it's a partnership, give and take. So what we try to do is to really make sure that we are having the conversations, up front with all parties. And, we've had some of those together, right? Really making sure we get to know each other even before a first program. Like, what are you looking for? What are we looking for? What kind of programs can you support? What's on your roadmap, right? Where can we work together? Where are those sweet spots going to be? Um, and then we really take that throughout the process. I've talked about implementation before, and I think this is, very important. We've always had, I'm going to say, kind of the weekly, with the boots on the ground, calls between a tri-party call between, the bank, the client, and the processor, because we feel like that's where telephone is a very dangerous game. You say one thing, it gets dropped, or et cetera. So we want to make sure that everyone is on the same page. But we're doing that also at a higher management level as well. And I think as we work together with strategic sponsor banks like FinWise and like our other partners, we get to know each other, right? We get to know what are the things where is that opportunity we're going to work well together. And I think, everyone could be a little bit different. I think we approach it in the same way that we're going to have the partnership. We want to have the transparent communications. But I think it's really that, like I said, coming across um, the cultural divide, right?
Mm-hmm.
And working together and getting to know our counterparts so that we can take the friction out on behalf of our mutual clients. And I think it really, I know it's working. I have to say, because some of my internal stakeholders have wanted to expand the model.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, I know that it's working because of that. So I think it's really um, and this applies in so many realms of life, right? It's really getting to know your counterpart. And so when there are rough patches, because there inevitably are, right, something's taking longer, there's not finger pointing, there's
Mm-hmm.
not frustration. Everyone might want to move it a little faster, but if we are talking regularly, we know and we have insight into what the holdup is. And that way, if we have a strong relationship, right, we can also reinforce that to the client, right? And I don't want to say kind of normalize it, because we want things to move quickly, but like if the sponsor bank has reached a point where like things need to slow down because of something, we can help, smooth that over. If for whatever reason on the issuing processor side at Galileo something has to slow down,
Mm-hmm.
our sponsor bank, if they know us and they know what's going on, can be like, hey, like we know that this is only temporary, we understand, help to smooth that over. So I think just having that partnership, it just makes things easier. It takes time.
Yeah.
It takes investment of time. It takes an open mind. But I think it's really important. And I think that's really how we are, looking to work with our most strategic partners, is in that really a partnership fashion. Because it's a little bit of a strange relationship, right? We both are, serving the same client, but we're doing these things on behalf of our mutual client, but we need to work well together in order to serve that mutual client. So that's really the view that I try to bring internally to my internal, stakeholders, and put in practice in how we're working in the model that we're using to work with our strategic bank partners.
Love those words of wisdom. Thank you for that. And I knew this was going to be a fun conversation. So
Yeah, exactly.
thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I hope that we can have you back real soon.
Oh, would love to. Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to talk with you and Bandy about these ideas. And then I got a few of them we're going to have to move forward. So it's been great talking with you, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening.